Right, we are here for Experience Talks. I am very happy to welcome our guest for this show, Dr. Connie Zweig. Connie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So here we are at Experience Talks, and Connie Zweig, PhD, is a retired therapist, co-author of Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow, author of Meeting the Shadow of Spirituality, and a novel, A Moth to the Flame, the life of Sufi poet Rumi. Her new book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, which comes out Tuesday, by the way, September 7th. So mark your calendars or pre-order it on Amazon now. That book extends shadow work into late life and teaches aging as a spiritual practice. Connie has been doing contemplative practices for 50 years. She's a wife and grandmother and was initiated as an elder by Saging International in 2017. After investing in all these roles, she is practicing the shift from role to soul. So Connie, I'm very excited to have you here and finally to meet you. I can't believe we spent this much time not knowing each other yet. So I'm excited to talk to you.
I am too, thank you.
So Connie, your new book, as I mentioned, comes out Tuesday, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul. Can we start off by having you read a brief passage from it and give us?
Sure, I would love to. Here's the new baby, just being delivered. And I'll just read a few paragraphs for you. We all have the opportunity to radically reinvent and reimagine the process of aging for ourselves. And I don't mean merely doing more or doing differently. I don't use reinvention the way many experts do from the outside in. Rather, my emphasis is on the internal, less familiar terrain of soul, the subtle yearnings that appear in images and fantasies, the ways we respond or fear to respond to those messengers, and the symbolic meanings we glean from them. As we learn the psychological and spiritual practices in this book, we discover how to orient to our inner worlds. We deepen our self-knowledge and become able to reimagine age for ourselves, eventually shifting from denial to awareness, from rejection to self-acceptance, from obligation to flow, from holding on to letting go, even from distraction to presence. And the result is a newfound freedom from the constraints of past roles and identities, an emerging sense of becoming who you were always meant to be, and a profound gratitude for the way that your life unfolded. This is the deeper dimension of age, the universal inner journey of human development, which includes the extraordinary potential of this stage of life, the unfolding of our authenticity and authority, and even the unfolding of advanced stages of human development, which are described in every spiritual tradition as the purpose of late life. This process is not about what we do or don't do. More work and more volunteering, less work and less volunteering. Rather, it's about how we do it. The internal state of mind that can arise as we do this inner work. This deep work is a unique journey for each of us, but the hunger for it is universal.
I love that. Such a timely thing, because that the idea of shifting from doing to being so resonates with me. Feels like I've been doing forever. Being sounds so cool right now.
It's alluring.
So what inspired you to write this book now? You've written books. You obviously have a depth of thought around the ideas of spirituality, aging, staging, all of this stuff. Why now for this book?
Well, as I entered my late 60s, I really began to feel disoriented. And even though I've been meditating for my whole adult life, the sort of basic existential questions returned. Who am I? If I'm not Dr. Connie, the shadow expert, who am I? And eventually, as you mentioned earlier, I took this training to become an elder. And I read widely in all of the aging books, the conscious aging, positive aging movement books. And what I found was that there was no material about the shadow. There was no material about the unconscious process, or what I call the inner obstacles to aging consciously. So I realized there was another book to write, and I had not intended to do that, but it started to call to me, and I took about 2 years to kind of sit with it and make the decision. And then it just kind of came through.
This is a monster book too. I mean, it took you 2 years to start to write it. I would imagine it took you a while to write it too. There's a lot of stuff in here. I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah, it's kind of dense, and people are telling me they need to kind of chew it and digest it slowly. But it didn't take me that long to write, because my psyche kind of prepared by, first I immersed myself in the research, and I did a lot of interviews, and then it just kind of organized itself. And that's how the other books happened as well. I kind of use meditation with my writing practice. So I kind of fill myself up and then I empty out.
That's great. I like that.
And there's a rhythm to the whole thing. And after the emptying out, the writing just kind of flows.
It's fantastic. So you mentioned the shadow. I want to first talk to you about shadow work to kind of do some constructing the base of the pyramid here about who you are. One of the cornerstones, obviously, of your expertise. Can you talk about what it is, shadow work, and then how people can use it to make a better life for themselves?
Yes, and let's clarify, it's not who I am, right? It's a role. Teaching about the shadow has been a role for me, which now I'm really releasing. As this book comes out, I'll be able to let it go more and more. And I think, you know, if we don't do that, then we lose the opportunity to identify with something deeper. So the shadow was a term coined by the renowned Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung for the personal unconscious. And he and Freud discovered the whole process of repression into a part of us that kind of carries throughout our lives the material that we don't live out, the material that is unacceptable or shamed or forbidden, whether it's feelings or behaviors or fantasies, they get stuffed. And it's a natural process as we're growing up that our conscious personality gets narrower and narrower as more material is banished into the unconscious, into the shadow. And then what Jung called it is there's a whole unlived life in the shadow that's kind of moving parallel to our lived life. And so he worked with the shadow material primarily through dreams and also through active imagination, which is kind of a spontaneous creative process. After Meeting the Shadow came out, which is a long time ago, I think it was in the late 80s or early 90s, it struck a chord, and I was kind of surprised by that. So I ended up, after graduate school, writing Romancing the Shadow with a colleague of mine. And we created this method of shadow work to be able to detect this material that's buried, that's dormant or unconscious in us, by teaching people to tune in and listen to the whispering voices that they rarely attune to, or the feelings as they come up and then get stuffed down again, or the physical sensations that just are fleeting. And as we start to attune to thoughts, feelings, and sensations, what we find is they're repetitive and they have patterns. And as we find the pattern of the same inner dialogue, we can detect that there's an aspect of the shadow there that we call a shadow character. And that shadow character, let's say the inner ageist, which worships youth and denies aging, that shadow character in me or in you has the same thoughts, feelings, and sensations every time it comes up. So we start learning how to build a conscious relationship with material that was previously unconscious. And it's tricky, it's slippery, you know, it recedes again into the darkness. And then we have to catch it the next time. And then that's kind of the process of remembering and forgetting about the shadow.
Great. It's such an interesting metaphor for aging in this country too, the idea of the shadow, because, you know, ageism is to me one of the big isms, and frankly, sadly, one of the more acceptable ones in this country. And we don't want to look directly at aging or death in this country. So the idea of the shadow in this culture seems to be really prevalent in terms of getting older. In what ways can we change how people think about that aspect of it? Is there a way that we can get Americans to somehow shine a light on that part of our darkness?
Well, you know, our personal shadow is embedded in our family shadow, which is embedded in our religious or tribal or social shadow, which is embedded in the national collective shadow. So if ageism is a collective institutionalized bias, which we know it to be, it became really ugly during the COVID pandemic. We could hear it expressed. Then it makes sense that most of us will have internalized ageism from that collective attitude, an institutionalized attitude, whether it's in the family or in the workplace or in the healthcare system. And
it's kind of playing one thing against another. It's like playing generations against each other and making it seem like we're competing for something.
For resources, that's right. So there is fantastic research out of Yale University, a psychologist named Becca Levy, whose work just blew my mind. And that was one of the reasons I decided to write the book, because she was talking about the shadow, even though she wasn't using that language. She was describing the effects of internalized ageism on our bodies, serious health consequences, on our brains, memory, cognitive consequences, on our longevity, on our will to live, on the way that we experience retirement. In other words, how we believe, fear, fantasize about retirement shapes how we experience retirement. And she's shown this over decades now. And when I saw that, I realized that the unconscious shadow material is affecting the body, mind, spirit of each of us. And that working on ageism from the outside in alone is not sufficient. It's like racism. It's just like racism.
Yep.
We can see that we have not legislated away racism. It's obvious to us now. So the same is true of ageism. And so I just kind of saw that the need for the inner work, along with the social, outer, political work, is really imperative. And there's very few people who are kind of building that bridge. There's a fabulous anti-ageism movement being born now. You know, the World Health Organization has recognized it. Several women's magazines no longer promote anti-aging products. The media has begun to take on older characters in a way that's, you know, where the dialogue is not pejorative and condescending. And you may have noticed a shift there. I think it's not completely happening, but it has started to happen. So that means that the kids may have a different chance to internalize a picture of old age than we had. I mean, for myself, I didn't have one positive grandparent model for myself. I had a lot of negative comments from my father about older people. So as I started to kind of uncover in myself the roots of my own inner ageist, it was shocking. And I don't think I'm that unusual in this way.
Yeah. Yeah, and the comparison to race makes a lot of sense. I think because that is a discussion that's happened probably longer than ageism, and certainly louder and more prevalent in recent years. That idea of admitting it, again, shining the light on a darkness is everyone has racism inside them, and until we admit that, we can't possibly fight it. You have to address it and be honest with yourself about it first, it seems.
Yes, we have to overcome the denial, step one. Yeah. Not enough, but definitely step one.
Yeah. The new book has an amazing series of interviews from prominent elders, like just to name a few: Ken Wilber, Krishna Das, Father Thomas Keating, Anna Douglas, James Hollis, many other just amazing people. And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall of those interviews and watch them. It's great to experience them in the book. I just wonder what that experience was like for you to interview these people and have a sense of focus on what you wanted to get from them. And was that always an important part of writing this book?
It didn't start out as an important part of writing it. I don't remember how that idea came to me. There was a lot of synchronicity. In other words, Krishna Das, who's the big chant leader, kirtan leader, who's extremely popular in the world of Hindu mystical bhakti yoga folks. I reached out to him and he said, I don't know, I'll have to ask my guru. And then he went for a walk and he walked into a bookstore and he saw Meeting the Shadow. And he came back to the computer and emailed me and said, I got a yes. And there were a lot of sort of stories like that. Ken Wilber was a very old friend. A lot of the people I didn't have earlier friendships with, who were just really gracious with their time, especially people in their 80s when time is, really, really precious. I was lucky to interview Father Thomas Keating just before he died.
Wow.
And he, told me the sort of he gave me a spiritual life review and described the process of his awakening. And it was very moving for me. So I feel a lot of gratitude to all of these people. I'm not rooted in the Buddhist tradition. I'm kind of rooted in the Vedanta tradition. So for me, the Buddhist teachers like Roshi Wendy and Anna Douglas were really kind of revelatory in their the way that Anna Douglas describes what the Dharma says about aging. She seemed to be the main Dharma teacher who's teaching that.
That's great.
And Roshi Wendy, who's very Zen center, very focused on service as practice, really kind of building bridges between meditation and service. So, they all had their contributions to make. And there are some Jungian analysts in there, who have a more depth psychological perspective. And so it became kind of very eclectic.
Yeah, I wonder what James Hollis is somebody that I would love to talk to. I think he's number one on my have coffee with list.
I just got an email today. He's in his 80s.
Yeah.
And he's continuing to write and teach. And he's he's very focused on what I call mortality awareness.
Yeah.
And that for me is a crucial kind of quality of awareness to become an elder, because if we're in denial of death, then we're not facing that shadow. And regardless of our beliefs about death, it's not this book is not about beliefs.
Yeah.
You know, the individuality, my Conniness will die. And so Jim and I spoke about his mortality and how he's focused on that and working with that awareness.
It's fantastic. We were talking before when we were testing the sound and video to make sure we sound and look cool. We realized we were at the same Jackson Browne concert at the Arlington Theater a long time ago, and with Jackson Browne and friends. And he mentioned the fact that his new album has a lot to do with the idea of aging, and the fact that he was great friends with Warren Zevon, who wrote a great album when he was dying. So it's interesting how, you know, art and thinking turns into what you're facing as you face it.
And in Leonard Cohen's final album,
Yeah,
oh my God, just
Yep.
sheer poetic eloquence about being old and dying. Yeah.
Yep, unbelievable. So as the subtitle of your book suggests, the idea of shifting from role to soul, you know, you mentioned that part of it. That to me is the most, you know, really new ground being plowed here. You know, I've read almost every aging book that anyone's ever thought of writing. And a lot of the stuff that's come out in recent years is, you know, sense of purpose and reinventing yourself and inventing new roles for yourself and staying relevant as you get older. This is such a fresh and new idea for me, that the idea is that stuff, maybe it's fine, but unless you come at it from a different angle, you're just going to create the same thing over and over again. And which sounds like the definition of insanity to me. So I wanted to understand, where did you come up with that idea, and how, you know, give us an example of how we might apply it from your work on the book.
Okay, well, I can't take credit for coining role to soul. It's from Ram Dass. And I remembered it from decades ago. Yeah. I don't know when or where he said it, but it stayed with me. And it was, you know, in 3 words, the message that I wanted to give in the book. And what I mean by that is that we've spent our lives, our heroic midlife period, identified with our roles. That's who we think we are, whether it's the mom or the CEO or the therapist or the nurse or the teacher. I am that. That's what we tell ourselves. And so as we grow old and the roles start to fall away and the responsibilities fall away and the structure of our day starts to dissolve around that role, then the essential spiritual question arises again: who am I?
Yeah.
Who am I if I am not that role? And so for me, this is the time to turn within and begin to ask that question in a spiritual context. And whether you're part of a tradition and a lineage or not, who am I if I am not that role? What is my essential spiritual nature that is not going to disappear if I stop working or parenting or earning money or whatever it is? Who am I really underneath all the masks? Underneath the persona, behind the personality, who am I really? And all of the perennial spiritual traditions taught that late life is the time to ask that question and return to spiritual practice or begin it for the first time. And whether that means meditation or prayer or chanting or mindfulness or breath practice, whatever that means to you, I'm not prescribing what to do. I'm not prescribing what to believe about it. I'm really suggesting that all of that is your choice, but my point of view is now's the time.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was writing some notes about the book early this morning, and there's a part of the book that you write about dusk, and I was kind of jotting it down because it was meaningful to me at the time. You talk about the time between the world of light and the world of darkness, and about making the transition from doing to being, from fast to slow, from outward to inward. And again, that, you know, that it's just such new ground for me. And I love the metaphor of dusk, and how it seems like a perfect time of day to think about that. And also it reflects the, you know, the shadow and the light part of what Jung and company have talked about. One of my favorite books of all time is Memories, Dreams, Reflections, which was the last book that Jung wrote when he was dying, and kind of turned his wonderful psychological mind inward on himself. And it's one of those books that it's just astounding.
Yes, it is. So, you know, dusk is a liminal time. It's an in-between time. It's not day and it's not night. And so it has been my meditation time for all these decades. And it reminds me what Jung said about this. He wrote an essay called Stages of Life, and he said in it, the morning of life has a different meaning and purpose from the afternoon of life.
Mm.
The afternoon of life has a different meaning and purpose. If we don't discover that, if we continue the purpose of the morning, then there's damage to the soul. So the shift, you know, from the morning to evening, and what we're talking about, is a shift in attention. It's a shift in priorities and values. It's not only a shift about behavior, what we're doing or not doing. It's a shift in our state of mind. So someone can be doing more in a state of mind that's really spacious and not controlled by the ego's agenda, and not really attached to the outcomes, and understanding her own shadow issues and motivations. And it looks the same as someone else who's doing it from a really driven inward push to get things done. It doesn't look any different, but
Right.
The quality of the state of mind is really different. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to communicate, that there's a heroic way of doing things and there's an elder's way of doing things, and that the elder's state of mind into soul is the shift that I'm calling for.
Yeah, and it seems like it, you know, you mentioned that, you know, the letting go the ego, that seems to be a huge part of it, because again, you know, American culture, the first thing people ask is, what do you do? And so there's the eternal question of, you know, how do I answer that? And it's, you know, for some people who do work like you and I do, it's a complicated question to answer, even when you're doing things, let alone when you're making the shift to not doing things. So you are as you mentioned in your own bio, you are practicing this shift from role to soul. Talk a little bit about your own origin story, because, you know, you're a psychologist, you were a practicing psychologist, author, developed a deep interest and big expertise in the work with shadow, and then now you're, you know, again, you're applying this to this next phase of life as it faces you. How is that, you know, have you been the same person throughout that road, or is there, as you get older, has it changed? Has your outlook changed? Is that part of the secret of what we need to learn how to do?
It's such a good question. So I am, you know, the book comes out next week, and I've got like 40 events booked. So I am in this kind of, I said to someone today, I feel like there's a tidal wave coming at me.
Right.
And he said to me, time to surf.
And
so, yeah, so I feel as if my job right now is, well, several levels. One is how to do the teaching differently than I did in the past, how to do it as an elder, because I want to walk my talk.
Yep.
So how do I do it as an elder? So one thing I notice is, although I'm working a lot, I'm not allowing the driver in me, the shadow character that has really pushed me hard in the past, to take over. And so using self-observation, what I notice is if the driver starts to take over, in the sense of I'm overriding my body's needs, I'm neglecting my marriage, I'm neglecting my sleep or meditation, then I stop.
Yeah.
And in the past, I may not have done that. So I stop, I take a breath, I recognize that the shadow character is there, and I do something differently. Also, there's a way in which my ego used to be really attached to the outcome of things, the feeling of control. Well, if I do this, then I'm good, then that'll happen. If
Yep.
I do this, then 100 people will show up, or 1,000 books will be sold, or blah, 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 whatever it is. I'm not feeling that right now, Tim.
Yeah.
I'm kind of feeling I'm giving it my best energy and intention, and whatever happens is going to be okay. And there's a freedom for me in that, because guess what? I am not this book.
Yeah.
It's not who I am. It's my gift, but it's not who I am. And when I did the life review, which I teach in the book, and I add the dimension of shadow to it so that we learn how to review your unlived life in the shadow. And when I did that for myself, what I saw was that my 4 different careers all had the same mission, which was to transmit information about consciousness.
Yeah.
That has been my dharma, whatever we call it, the Tao, whatever name you give it. And I'm feeling at peace with that now, so that whoever this book touches, it's my gift and it's wonderful. And I can't control it. I can't do any more than that. And that's really a relief. It's a great relief.
Yeah.
So, I'm practicing this in a number of ways. My intention, we just moved and we downsized hugely. And we have a different lifestyle planned here as soon as all the book stuff is done. And what I realize is that I'm practicing downsizing my ego. That's kind of the essence of Roll to Soul. And that as that happens, and I continue my spiritual practices, I will sit more and more in that deeper identity. I taste it now, but I will live it more and more as I, move from the doing into being more.
And that seems like what should be the gift of age to everyone. That just sounds right to me. Sounds like surfing, kind of.
Yeah.
This sounds like it's going to be a very different book tour for you, to me.
Well, it's all online.
It's a lot of event. Yeah, that will make it a different book tour for sure. But
all of it is online.
Yeah.
And so the learning curve for tech has been really intimidating.
Yeah.
For me. And so in a way, we'll see, we'll see how the challenge works out. But that's kind of my attitude right now, is just, we'll see. I don't feel that worried about it.
You show up well on Zoom. That's all I have to say. And who would have ever thought anyone would have said that ever? So who are some of your influences? And I know they may be different as a psychologist and an author and a shadow worker and a sager. who are some influences that jump to mind in terms of people who have influenced your thought, and then have those influences changed as you've gotten older?
Wow, that's a big question. I would say that when I turned 19 and I was at UC Berkeley, I wanted to date a guy, and he wouldn't date me unless I learned transcendental meditation. And so I started meditating, for no noble reason except to date this guy, Paul. And it completely, turned my life around. I think I probably would have been an academic if not for that.
Yep.
And so I spent a number of years with Maharishi, the TM guy, became disillusioned and left that in the late 70s. But during that time, I read Ram Dass and I read Autobiography of a Yogi, and those books were really formative for me.
That's fantastic. I don't stop. I'm going to move to the plug, because as sometimes happens on Zoom, I'm running out of energy on my computer. So
okay.
I apologize, but keep talking.
So, so those were formative spiritual teachers. And when I was working in the publishing industry, I was really reading widely and developing a lot of books for publication. And then my boss decided to sell the company. And so I went back to grad school and started studying Jung really seriously.
Yeah.
So, the world of Jungian authors became really influential for me, but it was also missing something for me, which was the transcendental. And so I knew a lot of people from that world, like Ken Wilber and Roger Walsh and Francis Bond, and the people in the transpersonal psychology world. And so I tried to hold Jung with the depths and transpersonal with the heights.
Yeah.
And during that time, did Romancing the Shadow, and Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. And then I started to have these experiences, which I don't talk about very much, but for some reason, I'm going to share with you. Mm-hmm. I started having dreams of Rumi. And I was immersed in reading different translations of the poetry at the time. My husband and I were reading to each other, usually every night before bed. And so I had this series of dreams in which he came and spoke to me. And I started writing them down and realized that I should probably tell the story. So he became, a surprise visitor / teacher and big influence that led to a novel, which I had never planned on writing fiction. So that was, and we went to Turkey and we studied Sufism. And
wow.
So
it's so
that
interesting that you described him as a surprise visitor, because my favorite Rumi poem is The Guest House. And
yeah,
it's basically like a phrase that could be lifted from that poem.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So, then after that, I've had a series of spiritual teachers. And it doesn't matter really who they are, but, and I would say the biggest influence in my adult life is my husband, who is very highly evolved and very much a teacher for me. And, to my surprise, relationship has become a path as much as my meditation, I would say, so those two, marriage as spiritual practice and meditation, have really been, have shaped me for a long time now. We've been together 28 years.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
That's lovely. I want to talk about retirement. You mentioned retirement. the section of the book on retirement, again, really different approach to it. And obviously retirement is such a wide-ranging, strange concept in the United States of America. Can you talk about what retirement means to you, and then what it means to like us collectively, and how do we maybe think about it better?
You know, I realized at some point that retirement is like a Rorschach test, because we project all over it.
We do.
And we imagine that it's going to be everything we always wanted, carefree and wealthy and traveling and, you know, no responsibility. And on the other hand, useless and irrelevant and invisible. And so it has a lot of charge, both positive and negative charge around it. There's no one in my friend world who has stopped working. And we're all in our 70s now. Nobody has stopped working. And so there are a lot of people who are continuing paid work, and there are other people who need to continue paid work and can't stop. And there are other people who, you know, stop in their 50s and find other creative outlets. My literary agent, whom I miss, retired as a businesswoman all her life and is painting full time. So
Great.
People find all kinds of surprising creative and volunteer outlets and all that. But my focus, you know, and the focus on doing like Encore Careers is very well known.
Yep.
There are millions of baby boomers who have started new businesses and do lots of volunteering, and it's all that. My focus is more on the inner work of retirement. So it's kind of what I was mentioning to you before. If we turn our attention inside and we start to attune to the inner voices and pay attention, are we heeding the call for a transition, or are we denying the call?
Yeah.
Are we paying attention to our feelings about it or fears about it? Or are we shutting them down out of, you know, too much fear? For me, as I approached retirement after 30 years of clinical practice, all this stuff came up. And one of the things that really helped me was doing a ritual. So I gathered colleagues around me and I created a rite of passage, which we don't have in our culture. We don't have any adult rites of passage. And I, you know, did a whole series of things, and then I stepped across a threshold and I set everything down that was in my hands, and I just realized I'm in a new stage of life and I want to be open and see what comes. So I have the privilege of doing that, and not everyone does. I'm really aware of that. And so if we need financially to continue paid work, the alternative is to change our state of mind about it, because we can still do meditation and other practices when we work, before, during, after we work. And we can begin to recognize that we can work differently. We can follow our breath. We can manage our attention. We can see the gifts instead of feeling the resentment. We can change our inner world and thereby change our outer world at work if we need to continue paid work. So retirement, the R word, is very charged, and it's, of all of the workshops that I offered people, that's what people most wanted to hear about. And I think it's partly because our generation, there are about 10,000 people retiring every day now in our generation. And people don't know what to do with themselves. Yeah. And like you said, we're so focused on doing, everybody's going to ask you, what will you do now?
Yep.
And that brings up dread. And so, So we need to kind of examine, I would say, our conscious and our unconscious beliefs about retirement, images about retirement. One of my clients, we discovered this image of a shadow character called the useless retiree, because he saw his grandfather and his father just look miserable and bored and depressed in retirement. And he wasn't really aware of that until we kind of excavated and uncovered that was why he couldn't stop his workaholic habits.
Yeah.
So I think that there's no should here. I'm not prescribing when or why people retire. I'm rather suggesting how to look at ourselves in that moment and see what's calling to us.
Makes so much sense. You know, it's almost like I want to encourage people to read this book before they read Encore and How to Retire on a Golf Course and all the, we had the Del Webb idea for 15 minutes where you should work until you're 65 as hard as you can, and then protect with your life your absolute power to not do anything with the rest of it. And, there's all these opposing ideas, but the underlying idea that you have that's so brilliant is maybe we should think more carefully about all of these things and decide who we are entering this phase of life. It's a great
and
concept.
we need the guidance. We don't have tools for, who's teaching us that,
I don't know anyone that is.
Yeah. So, so from my point of view, we need depth psychology and meditation in order to think more deeply and examine ourselves and really discover what's right for us now.
Yeah.
That was how our move came about. And, selling our big house and leaving an area that we loved, because internally we started to recognize a call. We were being called someplace else.
Yeah.
And to a different lifestyle. And in a way to a more humble. We don't need all that stuff.
Yeah.
In our 70s,
I love the connectivity between downsizing stuff and downsizing our ego too. There's this overall kind of umbrella idea of simplicity where you're kind of boiling life down to the essential stuff that you need, and the rest of it is hopefully magic.
And in other cultures, there are a lot of teachings about that. So for example, in India, the 4 stages of life in the traditional India, not so much today, student, householder, grandparent, and then recluse, monk, sannyasin. But our image of that, have you been to India?
I have not.
So there are all these wandering monks in their red robes on the streets with their alms bowls, right? And that's kind of the popular image of that in the West.
Yeah.
But for me, it's about an internal state. It's not about, I'm going to live in poverty and trust God.
Yeah.
That's not our culture. For me, it's about the internal renunciation, the letting go and the non-attachment that can arise as we release our egos, and we release our attitudes and our roles, our archaic outworn roles and beliefs. So there's a natural inner monastery that can come up at this time of life that calls to us. It calls us to turn within and to experience silence.
So great. Another part of the book that I think is, again, somewhat uncharted territory is you talk about both life-changing illness and death, which, maybe that's the biggest shadow we have in this country, and the hardest place we get to is trying to figure that out, discuss it even. Just talking about it seems to be a miracle in modern America. Can you talk about that part of the book and how that resonated with how does shadow work and internal work with those things, and how will that make us experience those things better?
One of the synchronicities that happened during the writing of the book was that I had two very close friends become seriously ill with cancer and die while I was writing the illness chapter and the death chapter. And so I was kind of living what I wanted to teach. And one of my friends, whose story is in the chapter on illness as spiritual practice, was very open, and our process was very vulnerable and very honest. And so I began to realize that illness was an opening. It had the capacity, it has the potential to be a doorway for shadow work, to be a doorway for not just not just therapeutic work, but actually going deeply into what's been unsaid, what's been unexamined. And we got into, I took care of her for about 2 years, and we got into a lot of material that was just profound for both of us. And so I could see that, and I don't want to romanticize cancer. I'm not minimizing the suffering. And there was something possible there that isn't possible when we're in our personalities and our egos and our agendas. It's just not possible. Those, the role and the role of patient caregiver fell away for us, and we became these two souls together. At one point we said it's like we're two ancient monks sitting on the Ganges together. That's kind of how it felt, because there was a level of being and recognition that was underneath the roles and the masks. And she could never have gotten there if, she hadn't had a lot of chemo and really been extremely naked with me. The other friend, I put the story in the chapter on death because the way that she died was just exquisitely beautiful and moving and surprising. And after the book was done, I had another friend die who modeled for us, for our community, a really conscious dying process. And he was in his 80s, and he had a lung disease, and he was never a victim. He never complained. He didn't express any fear throughout the whole thing. He was curious. He kept telling his wife he was really curious. And the last time I spoke with him, I said, what's going on? And he said, my mantra is allow. And that was really touching to me, that he was able to just allow the dying process to unfold. And Ram Dass's last book, Walking Each Other Home, was very much about that. And here was my friend Riley, who was actually able to live it. It was so precious,
Yeah, and again, it's a skill we should be taught. We should aspire to a death like that. We should aspire to be able to deal with a life-threatening illness like that. It's a gift to everybody involved.
That's right. Yeah.
And without what you're talking about, without inner work, and without focusing on how to get to that, we're unprepared for the biggest thing that will happen to most people in their life.
So my meditation practice now at least a part of it, is about practicing dying.
So
As
great.
I exhale and release the breath, I imagine, is that my last breath? And I just kind of surrender into it. And no one has taught me that. It's just kind of come up. But it's feeling freeing. You know, there's a way. I mean, and maybe it's just because I know it's not my last breath, you know.
Yeah.
But it does feel like an appropriate practice for this age and this stage. It just
Yeah.
feels that way. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like an appropriate practice, period. I
Yeah.
think it's, it's a wonderful thing to think about. So Connie, the new book is The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul. Goes on sale everywhere September 7th. Folks can order it, pre-order it right now on Amazon.com. Congratulations on the book. Thank you for being on Experience Talks. And I hope everybody reads this book.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Thank you. It was great talking to you, Connie. Good luck with the book and the tidal wave of events.
Let's stay in touch.
Let's do that and surf the next few
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.